All right, we're live. Let's see if anybody actually comes in here. So, tonight I want to just, you know what? It's the Halloween season. I've been super busy lately, and I just needed to come in here and kind of relax with you guys. I do not have the time to put out the content the way I usually do. So I've got a bunch of projects kind of on the back burner that I'm working on, and I just wanted to kind of just relax, just be me. I'm kicking back here with some apple cider. Hot apple cider. Let's get some music on here. Yeah, so tonight's kind of a different night, guys. We've had a lot of crazy topics, a lot of really good stuff happening on the podcast in the last little while, and I just kind of wanted to come in and just sort of relax with you guys and talk about some of the major topics. One thing that I do want to do here as we get a little bit further into the stream is just, not everybody knows where I stand on what I collect and what systems I love and what systems I don't. So I want to have that conversation with you guys, fill you in on some of the hot takes I've got about some of the consoles you guys might think are amazing and some of them you might think are trash. But that's where we're going tonight. So let's go back to the very beginning. Let's I guess not even the very beginning. General console generations would say the Atari 2600 was the second generation, really. I mean, you had Pong consoles and that sort of thing before that, but the 2600 is where I started, and I'm not really interested in anything that came before the 2600. The 2600 came out in, 77, 78, something like that. So, I don't know. Curious how the audio and stuff is doing here. Well, that just mutes that, so... Sorry, guys, I'm not much of a streamer, so I'm sort of experimenting with this as we go. Let me know what the volume is of the music and that sort of thing as we go. I don't know. I'm just kind of cobbling this together. I don't have any fancy layouts, no gameplay footage, nothing like that tonight. Just kicking back with you guys. So we were talking about the Atari 2600, and that's really where I started, but a few years late. I was born in 78, so the 2600 already existed when I was born, or came out around the same time. I think it was 77 when it came out. So I didn't really experience, as most of us, video games until I was maybe 5 years old, give or take. So I think my dad brought a 2600 home in around 1982, 83, obviously well past its prime and into the video game crash, and that's probably why he was able to pick it up for cheap, along with a good handful of games. So, at the time, I enjoyed the 2600 for what it was. I didn't know anything better or worse. It was my first experience, and around the same time, I had friends who had 2600s as well, and within a year or so, I remember I have some memories at the age of maybe 6 or 7 playing the Sega Master System as well, which I did enjoy. The 2600... it's really hard to go back to. I know that there are a lot of my YouTuber friends that really love gaming from that generation, the Atari, the Intellivision, the ColecoVision. It's really not for me. I mean, I have the Atari Flashbacks collection on the Switch, and I do enjoy it for what it's worth. There are a few games that I do like to go back to, but most of them are just too primitive for me today to really enjoy for anything more than 5 minutes of nostalgia anyway. So I'm not going to rank the Atari console and library very high for the most part on my list. I do not collect for the Atari or anything from that generation in my collection. Ooh, that sounds like it's maybe a little bit loud. So yeah, I don't collect for the Atari at all. I don't collect for the Intellivision or the ColecoVision. That's really just not my thing. I don't really collect a lot of the retro stuff. Like, I call myself a retro gamer, but I'm more of like a postmodern retro gamer. I really like stuff from the 5th and 6th and 7th generations, that kind of year 2000 to maybe 2010, 2012 sort of era. I feel like stuff that's more modern than that has lost its luster and become primarily about graphics and pixels and 4K and whatever, and most of the games that I've played on modern consoles feel like they have lost their way. They feel like, sure, there's been some exceptions. There's been some fantastic games out there. God of War 2018 was, everybody says it's amazing. IGN, can you believe this? IGN actually ranked, or I guess the people voting on IGN actually ranked God of War 2018 as the best video game of all time. Like, are you serious? Like, really? Like, sure, it was a good game, an excellent game. I haven't played it, but I know enough about people's reactions to it to know that it is an excellent game. People really, really love it and think it's maybe one of the top 2 or 3 games of the PS4 generation. And I'm not about to dispute that. But literally nothing in the 8th generation comes anywhere close to an all-time best list, in my opinion, because for the most part, everything on the PS4 and the Xbox One are minor refinements and regurgitations of old ideas that were, excuse me, they're just rehashing old ideas, whether it's the 17th Call of Duty game or the 17th Assassin's Creed game or whatever. I've really got a tickle in my throat tonight. Excuse me. So going back to the early generations, so I did enjoy a few games, and I still do enjoy a few games from that Atari 2600 generation. Some of the big iconic classics. I was more of an arcade fan, so I enjoyed stuff like Donkey Kong and Pac-Man in the arcades. They weren't that great on the Atari, to be honest. There were a few games that were pretty decent. I mean, I remember loving Frogger. I remember loving Chopper Command. I remember loving Defender, Missile Command, Asteroids. Some of those games are definitely iconic games and do make the 2600 worth going back to. But I think for me, for the most part, other than the poor controls, I'm pretty happy with having a collection of the best games on, let's say, on the Switch, right? Now, I am looking at getting my hands on, oh God, what is it? I want an arcade stick, and what is the company? It's just completely, of course, you're live, right? And your brain just turns to mush, apparently. But the 8-bit company, 8-bit retro bit 8, whatever. You guys know what I mean. They make a fantastic arcade stick for the Switch and Steam, and I've been looking to get one for a while, but it's not available at retail price in Canada. You have to pay import fees and stuff to get your hands on one, which is kind of annoying. It's going to cost me upwards of $200 to get one here. So I've kind of been trying to figure out how to get, but I think I'm digressing here, but I think an arcade stick like that would make playing Atari games on the Switch much more pleasant. The controls, trying to play Atari games with a D-pad is just kind of wrong. You really need that more, kind of the longer throw of having some kind of a joystick. I don't know. I couldn't really get into a lot of games. I did enjoy Crystal Castles, which was one of my favorite games back in the day, but Yeah, a lot of the games don't really seem to be suited to a D-pad, and that's unfortunate, but that's what you get when you try to emulate stuff on newer systems. So after the Atari 2600, and this is going to be a bit of maybe, I won't say controversial, but kind of a hot take. I don't really care about the NES. Now, of course, I respect it as a historical console. It was the console that turned everything around and brought video gaming back into the mainstream in the 80s, that saved the video game industry. I understand how important the NES is from a historical point of view. And don't get me wrong, I have tons of great memories playing the NES. I was the perfect age for the NES. By the time it actually rolled out in most places, it was about 1980, late 1986, early 1987, when it got to the point where all your friends had an NES sort of thing. And of course, I have tons of great memories of playing with my friends, being 9 years old, give or take, when I first experienced an NES. Like, what a perfect age, right? So, of course, I remember things like Mario 1, Mario 2, Mario 3, Zelda 1, Zelda 2. One of my favorite games from the NES is actually a weird little game called Karnov, which is sort of a platformer, I guess, but... Hey, Francisco. Yeah, you know what? We're going to get to the Switch here later in my rant. I guess I'm trying to put together sort of a ranking of all the consoles that I give a shit about and talk about what's good and bad about them and why. And yeah, you know what? I love my Switch and I love Nintendo in general, but as Nintendo consoles go, although the Switch, I do play it a lot, it's kind of soulless. It doesn't have the soul of something like the GameCube, for example, which just has this legendary library and this quirky appeal that everybody loves. And, certain handheld consoles like the DS and 3DS had such an appeal and such a personality, and the Switch is kind of soulless. I mean, it does a lot of things right, but moving further back into, the NES era again, I mentioned earlier that I had quite a bit of experience with the Sega Master System, thanks to one of my best friends having a Master System. I didn't have one, but I spent a lot of time at her house back in the 80s, and I have a lot more memories of Sega than I do of Nintendo. I played a lot on her Master System, and then eventually, when it got to be sort of 1990, and we were starting to look towards the next generations, I actually went out and purchased with my own money from my first job a TurboGrafx 16. And that's where all of my sort of 8-bit, 16-bit personal memories at home come from. The TurboGrafx 16 wasn't exactly a 16-bit console. It was sort of half and half, but it did a lot of things a lot better than the NES. And for me, looking back now, I'm nostalgic for the TurboGrafx 16. And of course, I'm nostalgic for some of those really groundbreaking NES exclusives, the Marios, the Zeldas, things like that. I love those games, but I have better ways to play those games. I have them downloaded on my 3DS. I have these games on my NES Classic, and I have some of them downloaded on my Switch, and there are just so many other ways to play these games. I don't really collect a lot of the older stuff, and I don't go back and play that stuff as much as you would think. Now, like I said before, I'm kind of a postmodern retro guy, so where I really start to get excited with stuff now is when we're getting into those kind of DS and PS2 and PS3 eras and stuff like that. I feel like that's a place where technology matured to the point where it was at the perfect place to give me the experience that I want without all the frills of the more modern stuff. So, yeah, going back to the NES, what are my thoughts? So, I do not collect for the NES. I do not intend to ever collect for the NES, except for maybe a couple of shelf queens that just look good on a shelf. I currently have Turtles and Turtles 2, the arcade game, behind me on my shelf. Well, behind this Halloween backdrop here anyway. But Yeah, I don't collect for NES, and even if I did, it would be digital stuff because I have no interest in mucking around with old consoles anymore. I do have a tube TV right over here, a nice Sony Trinitron, and I use it for older stuff like my original Xbox and my Nintendo Wii. I use it for that stuff, but I don't really bother with a lot of the cartridge-based stuff. I don't have an N64, don't want an N64. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's talk about the 16-bit generation, the true 16-bit generation, which was, of course, the big console war between Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Well, you know what? I love them both. They're both fantastic. But at the time, I was a Sega Genesis fan. At the time, I loved my TurboGrafx and I loved my Sega Genesis. And I never, and maybe this is part of the reason why I'm not really nostalgic for the Super Nintendo. There are some great games on it that I appreciate going back to now, some absolutely legendary stuff. And going back to that conversation about that IGN article from last week where they ran this big poll and got millions of people to vote on the best game of all time. I'm sorry, but the best games of all time were decades ago. Stuff like Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo, or Legend of Mana, or Final Fantasy 3 or 4, or those would be contenders for best game of all time, and some newer stuff too. But cookie cutter stuff on the PS4, like literally nothing on the PS4, in my opinion. This is just me, and maybe this is a hot take, and feel free to disagree with me if you want. But my opinion is there is nothing on the PS4 that deserves to be even in the top 100 list of best games of all time. Like, of course, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of games out there, probably 100,000 games or more that are relevant games that people have heard of over the last 40 years. And I'm sorry, but God of War 2018 is not number 1, it's not number 10, it's not number 100. Maybe it's number 279. Like, yeah, it's a great game, excellent game, but it's not best game of all time material. So, Super Nintendo, a lot of guys my age, being in late 30s, early 40s, consider the Super Nintendo to be that holy grail, the best that 2D graphics ever got to be. And, they're pretty much right. I mean, we did have some really impressive 2D and 2.5D stuff on the PlayStation 1, and we had a bit of a renaissance on the PlayStation 1, where a lot of people would consider, especially with JRPGs, that the PlayStation 1 would be kind of that holy grail where we got the best of the best blend of 2D and 3D stuff. I don't like early 3D stuff at all. So, yes, do I love the Super Nintendo before I move into the 3D era? I do love the Super Nintendo, but more importantly, I respect the Super Nintendo. I respect the ideas. I respect, the effort, the creativity, the ingenuity that went into doing new and risky things in that era that we don't see anymore with these cookie cutter games. Like I was saying before, Call of Duty 17, Assassin's Creed 17, whatever. Like, they just keep pumping out these games that are the same. And I guess that's what sells, right? But I really appreciated it back in the day when every time you popped in a game, it was a completely new experience. Whether you went from a racing game or a platforming game, or you went to something like Mega Man or whatever the case was, Castlevania, you had a completely different experience. No two games were identical. Sure, there was similar games, especially in a series like Final Fantasy, or Dragon Warrior 1, 2, 3 on the NES, that sort of thing. There were similarities, but for the most part, we were having unique experiences over and over again. So I really respect the Super Nintendo for that. And I really respect what Sega was doing back in the early 90s in terms of, again, giving us really cutting edge stuff. Like, I don't know if people today that weren't there at the time, I don't know if they really understand how mind-blowing Sonic the Hedgehog was. He literally, like, Sonic changed gaming forever. from the time that Sonic the Hedgehog was released, Nintendo was basically in catch-up mode, trying to do something that awesome. And arguably, at the end of the day, Nintendo did catch up and just barely surpassed the Sega Genesis in sales. But I think it was a pretty fair fight, but they definitely had to come out swinging. And that level of competition, we haven't really seen that kind of knockdown, drag 'em out fight again. Of course, we do have the Microsoft versus Sony thing, but most of that is the fans that are fighting about stuff. It's not the actual, Sony and Microsoft. Sure, they're competing, but they're not competing on the level that Nintendo and Sega were back in the 90s in terms of trying to outdo each other with unique experience after unique experience and better graphics and faster speeds. And, that's something that's absolutely missing in this era of gaming. And so, yeah, I don't collect for the Super Nintendo. I find collecting for cartridges, I have an OCD thing where everything I collect has to be complete, and I would probably I do have a Super Nintendo, but it's actually at Kaz's house. We've worked multiple trades because we both collect and we want to keep our cool stuff in the family. So I have sent stuff to him and traded for stuff back from him, but it always stays in the family. So I do have access to a Super Nintendo, and I do have a couple of cool games if I ever want to play them. But honestly, for the most part, I'm happy with emulation on devices like the Super Nintendo Classic. For the few games that I would really want to go back to, even a hacked Super Nintendo Classic is more than I need. When we start moving forward into the PS1 era, that's where I start to, we get into the disc-based stuff, and that's where I start to have more and more attention for gaming in general. Now, just recently, in the last 6 months or so, I have been on a quest to reduce my collection as far as possible to make it manageable. This started like 8 months ago with a 90-day challenge to try and actually accomplish some of the games in my backlog because it was getting out of control. I had thousands of games, and I really, every time I looked at this massive wall of games, I just didn't know what to play. I didn't know where to start, and I would often end up just going and watching TV and just, I'll figure it out another day. I'm not in the mood anymore. But it's like that Netflix disease where you spend so much time just scrolling through Netflix and not actually watching anything, right? So that challenge where I took 90 days and played a video game every day for even 30 minutes a day for a week just to give a game a solid chance to catch my attention, that really got me thinking about thinning out the collection and really playing games, owning games that I wanted to play and that I really cared about, and having more of a curated collection. So I got rid of several consoles. I got rid of my PS1 physical collection completely, just to remove that pressure of trying to accomplish, all this stuff in my backlog. I have a PS1 Classic, and I have some of those True Blue hack sticks that you just plug and play, and they've got like 200 or 300 games on each stick, and I've got like 3 sticks or whatever, so I've got like 3/4 of the PlayStation library digitally available on the PS1 Classic. I like that option for the times that I actually do want to play PS1 games. But you know what? For the most part, the PS1 games that I want to play are being released or remastered in droves in this generation. We're getting so many remasters and so many ports. Games like Legend of Mana just came out on the Switch. I got the physical copy from Japan. So, a lot of the games that I'm nostalgic for from that 4th and 5th generation era are getting ports left, right, and center, and there's rumors of new ones coming all the time. So yeah, PS1 gone, Super Nintendo gone, NES gone, Atari gone, all that stuff is gone. Where I really start to want to keep stuff is moving forward. So when it came into the other stuff in that generation, the N64 I never had any interest in. the experiences that I wanted to have on the PS1 were completely different than what Nintendo was offering at the time. I was addicted to games like Final Fantasy VII and Legend of Dragoon. I absolutely love those games, and racing games, things like Twisted Metal and Gran Turismo, and those were the experiences I wanted to have, and Nintendo was not offering that on the N64 at the time. So I never really had an N64, and looking back on it now, of course, there's maybe 10 games that are sort of essential for any game collection. You've got your Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and a few others here and there that are really important games for any collector to have. Of course, some of the rare games, your Banjo-Kazooies and Conker's Bad Fur Day and that sort of thing. There's some good games there, but not enough for me to want to own a system and collect for it. So that's actually why I'm sort of interested in the new Switch Online thing that's coming, where we're going to have N64 games available on the Switch. I'm kind of hoping that they do a little bit to upscale them the way they did with Mario 64 in the Mario 3D All-Stars collection. I don't know, maybe they'll just be straight ROMs, but it would be nice to see a little bit of work done to some of these games. I don't know. The early 3D, for me, I really don't like early 3D. At the time it seemed amazing, but it just has not aged well. Once we get into the PS2 era, and the GameCube era, they had enough horsepower and enough experience with 3D that they were able to, really do something significantly good with 3D. Not only the size of the games expanded, the size of the storage media expanded, but their experience in rendering polygons was a full generation better off. And that's really where I start to get on board with what I would call retro gaming. And the argument might exist that things like the PS2 and the GameCube are not retro. You really have to figure out how you define retro. For me, I would define retro as current gen PS5, last gen PS4, everything else retro. So PS3 and back is retro, in my opinion. I could be wildly wrong. There are other terms that are thrown around: retro, vintage, that sort of thing. I tend to think of vintage as like really old. For me, retro is NES to PS3, and vintage is anything like Atari 2600 and back. But these are kind of fluid terms that people throw around, and you never really know. There's no real guide out there to tell you exactly what it is, and there's all kinds of different opinions. So moving into the PS2 era, again, I was a Sony guy at that point. I had a